Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to chapter 3 of our analysis on René Girard's magnum opus, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. Here with you today, straight from three portions of this Western European universe, Owen Cox from London and Thomas Hamelryck from Copenhagen. I'm coming to you live from North Portugal. Hello, everybody. Welcome. And to situate us on our discussion and where we are and where we're going, Thomas is going to give us a little bit of a summary of the last two chapters of the book. Then I'm going to introduce to you this third chapter and what it's about. And then we're just going to go straight into the juicy stuff and to our own interpretations of that chapter. So Thomas Hamelryck, Dr. Thomas, take us away.
All right, let's do it. This is the book, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. It's for some reason it's the title that I can never remember. So we are at chapter 3. So we're going through this book chapter by chapter, and so let's start with just recapitulating what was in the first two chapters. So this is book 1. So the book is subdivided in 3 books. Book 1 is fundamental anthropology, so that's where we are now. Book 2 is the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and book 3 is interindividual psychology. So we're still at book 1. Chapter 1, book 1 was the victim mechanism as the basis of religion. So this explains the idea that Girard has about desire. So desire is triangular. There's always a subject and a model. The subject wants what the model wants. So basically we desire what others desire. And that's Girard's basic idea. And it's different from what other people have thought about desire, like Hegel and Freud and so on. Because we desire what others desire, we go into competition because we desire the same objects. And so desire also leads to competition, and it leads to conflict, and it leads to violence. And because of this tendency of desire leading to violence, there needs to be a mechanism for human tribes to get rid of that violence, and that's the scapegoating mechanism. So just blame some poor wretch on the outskirts of the tribe and kill that person, put the blame on that person, and that way you get rid of the aggression in the tribe. So in chapter 1 he describes this, and he also posits that religion basically functions as a way to set limits to desire. So that's prohibition, because desire leads to conflict. So let's regulate desire. So that's prohibition. And then religion also regulates the ritual. So ritual is nothing else than executing the scapegoating. So ritual also, religion also regulates that. So that was basically the theory of religion that he talked about in chapter 1. So this mimetic desire, scapegoating, and religion as a way to streamlining desire with prohibitions and with well-regulated ritualized scapegoating. Then in chapter 2, which we did last time, which is still not online, but which will be soon, is the second chapter is called The Development of Culture and Institutions. And there Girard talks about the key role of sacrifice in our institutions. So prohibitions have a tendency to create staleness, ossification, because there's so many prohibitions, right? If you have sexual prohibitions, how are you going to find a sexual mate, right? So there needs to be a time where you lift these prohibitions. That's ritual time. And because when you lift these prohibitions, you have more conflict. You also need to in tandem with lifting the prohibitions, you need to get rid of aggression using scapegoating. So that's the basis of our institutions. And he talks about things like kingship. A king is nothing else than a delayed scapegoat. He talks about hunting as a result of this scapegoating process. He talks about sexual prohibitions, the principles of exchange, death and funeral rites, and also the absolute centrality of the dead scapegoat in the symbolic order of the emerging human. So that's chapter 2. And on chapter 3, which will be introduced by Daniel, in chapter 3, he turns to the processes of hominization. That is, how do we go from animals to humans? How is that actually? How does that fit in with desire and scapegoating and religion and so on?
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. So yeah, chapter 3, we're going to talk about it today. is called The Process of Hominization. And the premise of the chapter, and to try to summarize it rather quickly, is the argument that the evolutionary road from animal to men, took place at the same time and perhaps as a consequence of the intensification of man's mimetic capabilities. Meaning we started to have these mimetic capabilities, we started to mimic people's desires, conflicts emerged and increased, not only people's desires, but this from an animal starting point all the way to the human endpoint, which is where we are now. And obviously we had to set limits to that desire. Animal societies naturally did that through the way there was immense conflict, but slowly we took that acquisitive and conflictual mimesis and set limits to it, set prohibitions to it, thus birthing culture. Now, at some point in the chapter, they say that humans are way more violent and way more horny than most animals, if not all other animals. Violence thus emerges as a problem to be controlled, as an outcome of this runaway sexual competition, right? Humans are in heat all the time. Animals are not. Nature has somehow evolved to the point that animals are in heat in a specific time of the year, so as to somehow naturally control how the rivalry will emerge inside of the tribe or inside of the group of the animals, but not with humans. And because sexuality is in all mammals a factor for social disorder and rivalry, right? Especially during heat. Periods of heat are period of conflict, of competition between males for females, for example, for resources. Then with humans, this problem is exponentiated. And so the point of this chapter is that social order had to evolve and to hominize with prohibition at its core. Prohibitions are thus fundamental for human society to work. And we can even say that today in our advanced societies, when we debate over social norms and prohibitions, we're actually kind of seeing, this is my interpretation, sublimated forms of this primitive intertribal violence. And Girard has an interesting point of view as usual, right? It's easy, according to Girard, to say that culture is where we sublimate these sexual and competitive dynamics. He says that, yeah, that's easy to say. That's a low risk statement. And what he goes towards is saying not necessarily where these problems happen, but the how. And I think that's a refrain that Girard has that underpins a lot of how he writes. He wants to say, you know what, Mr. Freud, you know what, Mr. Contemporary anthropologists of my era, you might be able to situate the problem. You might be able to situate how it shows, how it manifests, but you're not saying how it's happening and how it's working. And that's his big message, I feel, with mimetic theory. Now, perhaps just to kick off our discussion, let me just read out loud a note that I made that I know that will immediately trigger some discussion between us, which is great. I don't want to make this discussion a dichotomy between psychoanalysis and Girard, right? Girard oftentimes in this book says that Freud was a genius, he was right in this and that, but he is completely wrong in this and that and the other. And he's usually very enlightening in how he says that. But I personally think that this chapter and specifically, and perhaps many other ones that will come in the future, complement, they do not disprove psychoanalysis. Girardianism is compatible with psychoanalysis, or to be more specific, the Freudian tradition, especially in its later forms under Zizek or through Lacan, I feel like that is incredibly compatible with Girardianism. And I see a lot of overlaps. And the bridge that I take to make this statement is simple. If for the later Freudians, prohibition and oppression is seen as something that can be enjoyed and constitutes one of the many forms of jouissance, it's not only the case that oppression and prohibition is detrimental for our desire. It can also be the case that we can enjoy prohibition and oppression. This is a correct and rather useful insight. Then Girard points to the origin of these prohibitions as an emergent evolutionary mechanism to prevent mimetic conflict and escalation. So on one side, we have Girard saying here's the actual origin of prohibition and how it emerged. And then on the other side, because as these prohibitions evolve through time and through culture, through hundreds of thousands of years of human culture, Girard says that they had to become incredibly complex, so incredibly complex, even that they're hard to track. Well, my point is that psychoanalysis is very good at tracking that. And with these concepts like the death drive, though they may not be complete concepts, they're very useful to track the development of these ideas throughout human culture. So the mimetic character of human beings makes us enjoy copying the prohibition, doubling it towards ourselves. The jouissance of the other becomes our own jouissance. And this complexities, this complexifies and enriches the field of human enjoyment profiles. This is, in essence, what I want to say with the connection between Zizek, Lacan, and Girard. It's very much an open idea. I wonder what you guys have to say about this and the chapter in general.
Yeah, I think there's two conversations there, and it's probably worth exploring both of them. My suggestion is that we stay with the chapter and the process of hominization a little bit to begin with, and then we can start to think about the conversation or the differences between psychoanalysis and Girard and mimetic theory in a few minutes. I think, as you alluded to, Daniel, one of the key things that Girard is saying in this chapter is that, okay, it's clear to us that at some point humans branched off from the early hominids and that this thing called culture happened. It's very easy to just say it was a result of evolution or it was a result of culture, and to gloss over the analyses of quite how this happened. I think he points to different schools of anthropology and says some are keen to emphasize the similarities between human cultures and animal cultures. So, for instance, the existence of hierarchies with some kind of leader at the top, but they don't precisely analyze the difference between the animal hierarchies and the human hierarchies. So, for example, he points to the fact that it seems like in animal dominance hierarchies, the lower males tend to be relatively accepting of their position and might challenge a dominant alpha on occasion, but will otherwise kind of the position will be relatively static, and they won't even trespass over the kind of implicit rules around sexuality. Whereas humans have a much higher propensity towards getting into conflict with people who are in the positions of power. The hierarchies are potentially much less stable, and he connects this actually to the development of the technology of weaponry, as opposed to fighting, say, with just tooth and claw. I think there's a nice passage where he's arguing that animals that fight with their claws, with their teeth, just by bashing each other, do have a kind of instinctive sense of where too far is. You can kind of wrestle and rough and tumble. I mean, you see this in dogs and cats all the time, right? They'll throw each other around, but they kind of know where to stop. Whereas once you start fighting with stones and rocks and whatever other weapons, it's much easier to kill someone. And especially, well, I guess, if you've got sharp weapons, it's much, much easier to kill someone. And so Girard is suggesting that whatever prohibitions that came about to regulate this kind of violence that humans discover once they start making weaponry is not the same kind of instinctive inhibition that animals might have and animals might have in their dominance hierarchies. This is the thing that we're referring to as culture, the cultural prohibition as opposed to an instinctive prohibition. Perhaps one of you guys want to take that up there.
Yeah, I think that what you summarized, I think, the first part of the chapter very well. So this is basically the title of this. So the subtitle is posing the problem, right? So I think that in another book he calls this the problem of cultural Platonism, in a sense that, so what is the explanation for a lot of human behavior? Oh, it's culture, or it's the death drive. So there's these big concepts that people think, oh, we all agree about this, right? but actually they cover up an enormous amount of questions, and also an enormous amount of explanations that can be given. So that's basically what this chapter does, right? So here on page 81 here, for example, on 83, he mentions Lady Evolution, right? So, what's the explanation for that? Oh, it's evolution. Now, nobody's denying the importance of evolution, or that the evolution is at the heart of this, but there's a lot more to it than that. That you can give many more explanations than just saying, oh, it's evolution, and then the rest is a mystery, right? So he writes it that so the new universal great mother, so Lady Evolution as just an explanation, and we shouldn't talk about things anymore, right? So, and as an alternative, so Girard gives this very well thought of explanation of the difference between animals and humans. So humans just started copying each other, and because they copied each other, so they copied each other's desires, so they had much more conflict, and they needed ways to battle that conflict, which is of course a scapegoating mechanism, and I think that's basically what this chapter is about. And then also I think this chapter also mentions other thinkers like Freud and Derrida and others, and then points out their kind of cultural Platonisms or their actions that they take for granted.
Yeah, it's the big it's a methodological thing almost. Whereas
it gives a lot more. It gives a lot more explanations than. So usually people kind of bring up these big words, it's evolution, is the emergence of culture. But then I mean, why does evolution lead to the emergence of culture, and why do we have religion and all of that stuff? And Girard basically points out that there are structures there that can be clarified and that can be described, and you can have a hypothesis about these. So I think last time we encountered the structural anthropologists, right, like Claude Lévi-Strauss and stuff like that. So they basically also had a program of unearthing the common mechanisms that you find all over the world in different tribes. And I think that Girard's program is very similar to that, actually, even though he tries to he of course tries to kind of emphasize the differences between his own system and the systems of the anthropologists such as Lévi-Strauss, Freud, Derrida, and so on and so on.
Yeah, I think the difference he's emphasizing between his thinking and the structural school is that they're not really interested in the process of moving from pre-human to human.
Yeah.
They're just investigating the apparently universal forms of ritual and structure that exists across cultures. But Girard is saying we have to think deeper than that. So like first time I spoke, I was mentioning there's the school that just want to point to the similarities between the animals and the humans. And then there's the other school that just don't really want to think about animals at all. They kind of just take the human culture as a given. I think there's a nice quote actually on page 84 where he's actually talking about psychoanalysis and Marxism, but in the same context, about positing these cultural Platonisms that seem to explain things. So he says, if you begin with the incest prohibition, the economic motive, or socio-political oppression, you can never really pose the problem of hominization, of how animals became humans, and the origin of symbolic systems on the basis of animal nature. Whereas precisely this needs to be done if we are to renounce once and for all providing ourselves with answers in advance of every problem we confront. The notion of the father does not exist among apes. So this is him going after that cultural Platonism that's like these theories come up with, like Thomas pointed out, these concepts, the death drive or class conflict or wherever, and read these into what's happened. But don't analyze the more simple, you might say, really, just the basic process of how desire might have led to forms like ritual and prohibition.
I do agree, but I want to clarify, because this is an important methodological point that Girard, circles around time and again throughout his book. I have a question, right? So here's the thing. Girard posits that the seeds of culture, of human culture, are to be found in the mechanism of the surrogate victim, and rightly so. And it's actually a very practical and operational insight. Great. But then he also says that as culture develops towards really advanced and really complex social forms, that things become like really complex. So yes, you can still track the mechanism of the surrogate victim, for example, in contemporary culture, but it will be found in incredibly complex and multiform ways as compared to perhaps this almost abstract mathematical formulation that he does in the book, which is, there's the surrogate victim, triangular desire, blah, blah, blah. We spoke about that in the recent books. So my question is, Thomas, having read so much of Girard, like my feeling is that there's a missing link from the formulation of the principle in these abstract terms, like in prehistory, surrogate victim, here's the 5 things you need to know. And there's a little missing link between that and articulating how that work plays out in today's society. Now, that missing link in the past has been taken up by these cultural Platonists. They looked at the forms, they called it names like death drive, they called it a variety of things. But Girard's genius insight is finding the operational mechanism behind that. So it seems like there's an incomplete thing happening here, where Girard says, hey guys, you're just cultural Platonists. You're looking at the shapes. You're not looking at the mechanism. But my question is, these shapes already do a lot of legwork. These concepts like death drive, they're incomplete, but they do a lot of legwork in characterizing how what we know now is mimetic desire manifests itself in really complex forms today. And I think that, does Girard do any job of rehabilitating these old concepts in the light of his insight? Or is that work still incomplete? Because I don't want to throw to the trash these cultural Platonist forms just yet. I want to think if it's possible to rehabilitate them, because the work of big guys like Freud, like others, cannot be wholly thrown into the trash with a passing comment saying, oh, it's all mimetic.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, right? So it's always good to know more about a phenomenon. Freud was, for example, very, very good about describing what was going on. I mean, there is repetition compulsion. People seem to kind of bump into the same obstacles all the time. So there is something that looks like the symptoms of the death drive are there. And Freud was the first one to really describe them and point out, like, look at what people are doing. Why is that? So it's not that Freud is completely worthless. On the contrary, Freud is a great observer, and he's very important to Girard. But it's better, of course, to really understand phenomena in deeper detail, right? I mean, the moment that we started learning about bacteria, it got a lot easier to treat certain diseases, right? That doesn't mean that everything that went on before the discovery of bacteria was worthless. I mean, like, a broken arm can be, you can work with that without knowing about bacteria, right? And do something useful. But after the discovery of bacteria, you're in a different world. And that's why I don't really, I mean, I know we also had a little bit of a discussion before we started this podcast, right? So I know that you're very concerned with salvaging psychoanalysis and stuff like that. And nobody has said here that psychoanalysis is worthless, but some of the practices of psychoanalysis will be misguided or even blatantly wrong if they go against these fundamental principles that seem to be the truth. It seems to be that seems to be how humans are structured. So just like after Darwin, biologists had to come to terms with the fact that Darwin unveiled a number of fundamental truths that are now still valid. That's just simply, you can't just simply get around that. And so that's where I would my answer would be like, well, some of these things are extremely useful. And also as a if you are a psychoanalyst and you have 20 years of experience with treating people and helping them, and you don't know about Girard, now I'm sure you're doing a good job, right? Just because of the experience but it of course helps to understand exactly how people are structured. And there seemed to be a fundamental anthropology that explains how people are doing, right? And that it features something like the death drive. We understand the death drive. We understand repetition compulsion. So these things are not worthless, but they can be looked at from a different point of view. They can be better understood, and that will lead to better results, in my opinion.
I agree.
So if that answers your question, or because it's always good to be very precise, right? So does Girard mean that the whole of psychoanalysis is worthless? I don't think anybody claims that, right? I mean, that would be an absurd claim. But for example, where do Freud and Girard disagree on the nature of the death right? These are the questions that I find very productive, because they're to the point, and you can be very precise about it. Otherwise, basically, just becomes some kind of it becomes a fight about nothing, right?
I agree, and I agree so much that I will say that is our mission then, because the work of experimentally updating psychological concepts from a Girardian light is incomplete. And you said that these are important questions. They're not important answers that are pre-given. Girard doesn't give us those answers. He gives us a way to think. And hopefully that way to think, which is better informed, can help us update these concepts, which I truly think that there's wealth there. That's my instinct. That's a gut feeling. But I agree with what you said 100%. It's just that work has not been done yet.
Well, I mean, a lot of the work is done in this book. This book talks a lot about Freud, Nietzsche, Christianity, Marxism. So, of course, a lot more can be done, but there's a lot in this book, actually. And I think that there's a tendency for people to say, like, oh, we'll clash a bit of Freud and Marx and Girard together, and then it becomes just one big gray mush, right? It's also very interesting to kind of say, like, well, this is where they disagree. I find it more interesting to see where they disagree than just to try to unify everything.
Let me read the following sentence, and I want you to guess who was the writer that wrote it. That's why psychoanalysis does not aim at liberating our desires so that we can freely desire what we want. What we want is not what we desire. Our innermost desire, as a rule, appears to us as what we don't want, what terrifies us. More precisely, it liberates desires only in the precise sense that we fully assume the impossibility on which our desiring capacity is grounded. Psychoanalysis endeavors to mark this impossibility out in a new way. Its premise is that we cannot get rid of a constitutive impossibility, but we can reinscribe it in a different way. Now, obviously, this wasn't... Okay, just a game. Who said that?
Zizek?
Yes. Very good. Now, when I read this, okay, I was trying to be a smart ass and I just got called out.
That was an easy one.
And so on. I didn't even make the accent.
Quotes in the chat beforehand and then says, who wrote this?
Yeah, that's
Yeah, and I know you're reading that book too, so that's like making it really easy.
Yeah, okay.
But I think this sounds to me good, right? So, but don't forget that Zizek reads Girard, right? I don't think he mentions him explicitly, but I have this book by another guy. I have it here. Let's see. It's this one. Zizek, a very critical introduction by Marcus Pound. Pretty good book. I really enjoyed it. And he basically really there's a lot of Girard in there, and he claims that Zizek knows about Girard and that influences his thinking. So I think there's also a lot of people who are and also Lacan. I think that Lacan probably read quite a bit of Girard, because also they met very early at a big conference in the States where Derrida was also there and stuff like that. So I think there's much more exchange of information and know-how than you would think. And I think also there's a lot of people who don't want to mention Girard because Girard is a Catholic and he claims that the anthropology of the cross is the correct anthropology and stuff like that. People just don't want to be associated with that, right? So they kind of reformulate these ideas in different ways.
Maybe this is just me going through the process of just being fascinated with the overlaps of these thinkers. But like the thing that I read out loud about that Zizek wrote, focusing on the impossibilities of desire, it's the obstacles, the model obstacle. And if you retain that distance and if you cultivate it, things happen. In this chapter that we're going through in Girard, Girard says that if the process of harmonization is actually not Girard, it's the guy who's interviewing him. If the process of harmonization is decomposed into its analyzable elements, we confront an ensemble of factors, each of which in itself could have easily destroyed the species. It must be that each of these impossibilities was in one way or another transformed into a resource, because together, by some mysterious alchemy, they brought about progressively humanized forms of culture and biological processes. This reads like Hegel. This reads like Zizek. I find it just fascinating that, even in the way that Girard frames, for example, I'm just winging it right now. Like when he formulates desire as a triangle that then gets transformed at the moment that you kill the victim and you all gang up on the one victim. That's sublation, or that's the negation of the negation. You negate each other in a conflict, and then you pick a third, you kill it, and all of a sudden something happens, and cultural forms can emerge from that. So dialectical, and so zoomed into the practice of desire. That's just what's fascinating me at the moment.
I think if I might say something on this point, I think one of the things it seems like Girard is going against, we've already mentioned the term, the cultural Platonism, but I think in particular the way that many of these philosophies can be made to act like cultural Platonism. I mean, so as an example, you could look at Marx turning Hegelian thought into a cultural Platonism and developing communism, which then seems to have not gone particularly well. I know Zizek does a lot of work to try and rehabilitate both of those ideas, and I'm not super well read in Zizek, but that's a point. I think Girard, like Thomas mentions, is a Catholic, and he's trying to make a case that whereas it's quite a vogue in post-Enlightenment philosophy to kind of be like, well, religion is over, religion is backwards, we need to think forwards, and it's all about thinking and coming up with new concepts. Girard is actually saying, no, there's actually a logic, say, in religious structures that is not so much about thinking and generating new concepts as it is just understanding the ways in which humans are predisposed to really fuck shit up, and thus having simple practices and simple institutions and simple rituals to regulate that, which doesn't need a continuous process of reformulating new thinking or new ideas or anything. And then I guess if I might make another point to the Zizek quote you bring out, Daniel, about what does he say about reinscribing desire in a different way? Now, this is something that is often said in psychoanalysis, but it's often not actually clear what the fuck they mean by that. Like, what does it fucking mean to reinscribe your desire in a different way? Or this is where I think, for example, some of the thinking that Thomas has done around ritual and prohibition is very helpful, because it does actually provide a kind of practical way around, okay, what do you do with desires that you can't act out in ordinary time? What do you do about funny kinks or about excessive rage or whatever? Oh, well, you can create spaces to go through them. I guess the psychoanalytic method would be you go to an analysis and you talk about them, you put them into speech. Whereas the Girardian lens actually, especially if you update it with some of the thinking around ritual, allows you to think of practical things to do with it. Or to view art, for example, if we bring in Puglia, to view art as another way of reinscribing desire in a productive and creative way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree with that. So that's also something that Girard himself doesn't really talk about, right? So if you read him, he seems to be very skeptical about ritual. And I think that's why it's interesting to reread this book from that point of view. So will we find spots? So I read this book before, but I mean, it's a big, complicated book. So you just reading it again brings up a lot of new information. So will we find instances where Girard sees or examines the beneficial aspects of ritual, of intoxication, of undifferentiation, of violence, of these things, or does he basically equate ritual with the mob killing a scapegoat? And I think to a great extent he does. But we don't have to follow Girard in everything, right? So we might actually think of rituals that are not simply mobs killing scapegoats, So the situations or rituals that might be potentially dangerous, but that stay away from the let's say the undiluted a mob, the undiluted ritual, which is a mob killing a scapegoat, right? So and then of course you see possibilities beyond just sitting down and talking to a psychoanalyst.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all the bringing the bringing stuff up into the symbolic, and I mean, always a good thing to talk about things and to put things into words and to be systematic about it. But there might be other ways of dealing with things, or of creative exploration, which of course what people are doing, right? People are making their own rituals all the time.
I think that the overlap here, and Owen, maybe to answer a little bit what you said, is that in Zizek especially, Lacan, I don't know if he frames it like that, but in Zizek especially, he says that the pervert's position is to come to a point of enjoying the symptom, as opposed to being feeling like it's a nuisance for him. It's coming to the point where you enjoy the nuisance, where you somehow reposition the desirer in relation to that symptom. So obviously, what does it mean? It means something different for each person because everybody has a different symptom. But that is the end goal of analysis, right? Bringing an analysant to the point of realizing that they play a part in choosing his or her symptom, which is often quite a feat, is precisely the end of analysis. And it might also be the end of good ritual design. I mean, the role of the scapegoat in all of these things is still very vague for me, but very interesting. I mean, yes, we know we're born into a culture that is based on the one primeval murder, which, you know, structures the whole symbolic order. Might there be a personal primeval murder in the life of each of us? Is that the relationship that we have with trauma, or am I just grasping at straws here?
Well, our culture is based on a religion that deconstructed the scapegoating mechanism, right? So Christianity. I mean, that has spread all over the whole world, which is a blessing and a curse, so to say, because, you know, we can't get rid of aggression anymore by killing scapegoats. It just doesn't work anymore. That's what Christianity has done, and also other religions, right? So the same ideas seem to have been around, right? Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of these religions basically seem to have understood some of the basic anthropology and revealed that. So what would be the end of psychoanalysis? I think it would basically be understanding the nature of desire, understanding how it works, and understanding how the desire is linked to violence and scapegoating. And then you can start designing your own ritual, as you say, right? And designing your own prohibitions, informed by true religion. I would argue you can't just create your own values like Nietzsche tried to do. But why? I just want to bring it back to the chapter because we're kind of running ahead of ourselves, and the process of hominization, right? So here on page 97, we and this is the second part of this chapter, which is called let me find it here, the transcendental signifier. So this is something that comes from Jacques Derrida, you know, the nemesis of Jordan Peterson, the postmodernist par excellence. So we have nothing against Derrida, you know, interesting guy. But basically he says that the transcendental signifier, right, that's a pipe dream, right? There is no signifier that you can use to centralize your understanding around, to build your understanding around, you know, or your anthropology or your philosophy. And Girard seems to really go hard against that. So there is actually transcendental signifier, right? It's scapegoat. So now we come back to the problem. So what this chapter is about, hominization. What does that mean? So language, religion, culture, all of these things, they happen at the same time, and it can be understood via the mechanism of desire and scapegoating. Basically, what is the first sign? So that's basically the it's the scapegoat that is killed and that brings peace. That's the first sign, right? So what is it? The signifier is the corpse, right? And the signified is what happens when you kill the scapegoat. The sacred, basically, right? So, and in order for the transition of animals to humans to happen, all of these things, they basically they evolved, they emerged at the same time over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, right? So increasing desire, increasing competition, increasing violence, increasing scapegoating, that means increasing language, because, we're going to kill that one, right? We have a very clear signifier, increasing religious aspects, which means prohibition, right? We're not going to desire in this way in ordinary time, and then also the regulating of the killing of the scapegoat, right? So now we have a clear mechanistic explanation of the emergence of culture. This is how we went from animal to human. It's the emergence of language, of religion, with its prohibitions and with its regulation of murder. All of these things happened at the same time, and this is how we went from animal rights, which because animals have rights as well, to human rights, which rights in the sense RITES, right?
Rituals.
Yes. So this is what this chapter is about. So this is the great thing, what I miss in a lot of thinkers. Of course, nobody really knows what Hegel thinks, so it's too complicated. But I mean, I'm joking. But I mean, what does Hegel say about hominization, right? What does Freud say about hominization? What does Marx say about hominization? So it seems that Girard has a mechanism that seems to have a lot more power of explanation. It's much more parsimonious than the other explanations, and that's what this chapter is about, right? And here on page 97, he basically battles or he brings up the idea of Derrida that, well, it seems to be that there is no transcendental signifier in the sense of a human a being that created the universe, but humans, the anthropology of the human seems to come with a transcendental signifier. Yeah. We seem to have that that's basically what we are. So, and this is again a very interesting take on it, right? So, because in some sense Derrida is right, there's no God outside of the world that gives us meaning. On the other hand, it seems that our anthropology gives us a built-in transcendental signifier.
Yes, built-in is the right word. Because, like, if we start with the words of famous pariah Jacques Lacan, when he says that the unconscious is the discourse of the other, that means that our we're born into a world where language and discourse already exists and has a shape and has a structure. And if our unconscious is this discourse of the other, then our unconscious bears the structural sign of the scapegoat whose death brings peace. Does this make sense? So the primeval murder kind of skewed evolution of man towards our status as a linguistic animal. Somehow there's a relationship there. Our unconscious, like you say, is structured, has the shape of a murder, in the Lacanian sense of the unconscious, right? And this is what allowed us to create prohibitions, to society kind of, this is the template. This might even be the template around which tribes exist. There's a bit on this chapter where Girard says that, in summary, it's the alpha that sets the example. In some mammal species, the single individual or several individuals that dominate the rest of the group frequently occupy a central position, and they're the ones who are constantly observed and imitated by other males who remain on the periphery. So everybody imitates things with them except for acquisitive behaviors. I feel like this speaks to the birth of prohibition. To the birth of prohibition, not only as a cultural form, but like embedded within the evolution of the animal somehow, which is what you're saying. And this is why, like, again, coming back to ideas like perversion, Girard has nothing to say about perversion. I think that the mimetic character of human beings makes us enjoy copying.
What do you mean, Girard? There's nothing to say about perversion. I mean,
okay, never mind. He does. He absolutely does.
There's an enormous amount of thing. He said a lot of things about voyeurism and sadomasochism and all of that stuff. I mean, that's perfectly. And that's what we're going to read in the last part of the book, right? Yeah.
I retract. Yes, he does.
Wait a minute. Let's go back to this. Yes. The perversion of Zizek. Why is it called perversion, I mean, it's kind of giving it a very, I mean, it's a very interesting spin on the word, right?
Yeah, it is. I just want to bring in this idea that, and this again circles back to Girard. It's not like he doesn't say it. I spoke too fast. He does certainly have a lot to say about all the constellations through which desire can manifest itself. We're probably getting ahead of ourselves in terms of the book, but he does have a lot to say about, voyeurism, exhibitionism, and so on.
I think it's worth.
I'm just trying to like frame this whole thing in the light of other concepts that are very fresh in my mind. So like the jouissance of the other becomes our own jouissance, and this.
Yeah, but then we have to be careful with blending terms here. Because I'm not sure what jouissance means in this context, right? So because jouissance is I think for a Girardian, jouissance would be the combination. Would be the fact that desire often has unpleasant consequences, and you still keep following that desire despite the unpleasant consequences, and that's difficult to explain, right? So why do you keep on pursuing the same woman who rejects you, right? That would be jouissance. But in a Girardian point of view, there is no inherent jouissance. I mean, there's a desire for an object, and this object is super valuable because it's so forbidden, right? So again, their jouissance could be a Platonic a culture, a concept of cultural Platonism, right? It doesn't have to be like that. But people bring up this, people just say stuff. Oh, the death drive. Oh, jouissance. Oh, perversion. And then I'm always a bit like, well, you haven't really explained anything. You basically took a concept. I'm not accusing you of doing that, Daniel, but in general, people just take a big concept from Lacan, from Zizek, or from another thinker, and then they just plaster it over all these phenomena, and they feel they've explained something. I don't feel that they've explained anything. What is that jouissance? Where does it come from? What's the explanation? Just giving something a name doesn't explain it, right? That's what this chapter is about. You can't just say like, oh, humans are here because of evolution. Yes, true, but it's a truism, right? Can we be a bit more detailed about that? You can't just say like, oh, humans don't kill each other because of culture. Yeah, true, okay, but can we be a bit more precise about this? Because otherwise, then you just use these big ideas and you plaster over. You basically say like, let's not explain anything because I've put this word here on the table, this big word, jouissance with a J, or culture with a J, or that drive with a big. And it's done, right? So jouissance, okay, but jouissance for Girard, I would say, is just basically desire for an object, and then all these unpleasant things that come from intense desire, especially desire where you're pursuing an object that is forbidden by a powerful model. This is what people do all the time. I mean, you pursue the woman that doesn't want you, right? Because the ones that want you, they're kind of like just there. You take them for granted. So you're going to run after this woman that rejects you, or whatever, a man that rejects you, right? And that's going to be the super valuable object, exactly because you don't get it. And I think that's nothing else than jouissance, right? But then suddenly calling it jouissance has plastered over a deeper structure that you can understand why it's going on.
I'll take your meta comment, and I'll try to be more precise and clear here, because I do mean something. I'm just like kind of like zooming in, right? Here's, when we say that desire is mimetic, and if we bring into the table some Lacanian ideas about the unconscious being the discourse of the other, then what we're actually saying is that whenever we desire, the terms of our own very desire are copied. They are of the other. They are never something inherent to us. They're always mimetic. So maybe the conclusion is very simple, and I'm just repeating a point that Girard makes, that the unconscious is mimetic through and through. Like these 20th century big concepts like the unconscious, as so many people have explained. Well, might it be that Lacan would agree with Girard and this idea that, when Lacan says that the unconscious is the discourse of the other, that when, to use a Lacanian term, when the individual procures jouissance and finds it, he must find it in excess of himself, right? And there's this relationship with the other that I think has some mimetic nature as well. And that's the whole
Yeah,
thesis.
I think that Lacan can be read like that. Yeah, I think so. But it seems that the other, seems to be very much seems to be related to the big the model out there that has an object of desire that is forbidden.
And here's why it's perverted and obscene. I'm just winging it with these two terms. It's perverted and obscene because sometimes the origin of the mimetic rivalry is set aside and you just copy what the other wants because the other wants it, because you're just used to copying what other people do. It's not that you want the apple or the woman. It's just that you just want to copy. That's the excessive jouissance that is probably embedded in. But speaking of excess, I'm exceeding my time. Like Owen, Thomas, do jump in if you feel.
There's a couple of points that I'd like to make. The first, which goes back a bit, just to this thing about the transcendental signifier, because Girard kind of makes such a simple critique of, say, the structuralist idea of systems of signs that I found it kind of, it's hilarious how simple it is. So the kind of big, bold structuralist claim, I guess, is that no sign has its meaning independent of another sign. So this pen only has meaning as pen because it's not Owen or it's not computer or whatever else. Girard says, and I'll read directly, there is a simpler model that is uniquely dynamic and genetic, but also completely ignored. This is the model of the exception that is still in the process of emerging, the single trait that stands out against a confused mass or still unsorted multiplicity. It is the model of drawing lots, of the short straw, of the bean in the epiphany cake. Only the piece that contains the bean is truly distinguished. Only the shortest straw or the longest is meaningful. The rest remain indeterminate. So what he's saying is that you can have a sign, say, for the short straw. You don't give a fuck about the other. You don't need signs to say that one's the second shortest straw, that one's the third shortest straw. It's just kind of undifferentiated nature, and then this thing that is a focal point. And Girard's theory, which I think is fascinating to grapple with, is that is the genesis of probably language, of systems of symbolization, is the ritual, someone being singled out who everybody hates and eventually kills. Whatever noises that get made during that ritual, the screeching, the crying, presumably at some point gets turned into a drum beat or some kind of pounding or some kind of familiar cry, and then that becomes a symbol. And then the next time it happens, someone makes the same noise or plays the same sound or bangs the same drum beat or whatever it is, or people put the same mask or beads or whatever it is around the victim, and there you go. There you've got a sign. And then you've got the origin of the sacred. I mean, it's kind of frightening as well to think that maybe language itself has its origin in this, not in, say, simple words. I think it's quite common to think, well, language probably begins with words for father and mother, right? The most near intimate relationships. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe it begins in the violent ritual. But then this in itself does provide a fun way to, say, go back to psychoanalysis, which is always emphasizing the excessive, you could say, psychic attachment. I think Freud uses originally the word cathesis, but psychic attachment to certain words and not other words, which makes sense if actually language has its origin in something that we might call the sacred, and the sacred is something that does ontologically exist. It's not just some kind of metaphysical bullshit made up by religious systems. The sacred, like we discussed in the last episode, is the strange liminal space that exists in the sacrificial ritual. And that is what language is attached to. So certain words take on this transcendental character, for example. And then to kind of just round off, I was thinking it's funny that the Lacanians, for example, are always saying this thing about there is no big other, the big other doesn't exist, and yet this non-existence exerts some kind of positive presence anyway. It's less than nothing in Zizek's term. Well, this is kind of, you can look at that in the Girardian sense and be like, well, the transcendental signifier is not the myth that sustains it is actually a bloody act, but it's surrounded by paradoxes, and that it's a bloody transgression of all the prohibitions of the community, and yet it's the very thing that ties it together. So it does kind of exert a real positive influence in its being, not what it pretends to be in the system of science.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, again, all these big words, right? The big other doesn't exist and things like that. People kind of seem to repeat these as mantras. You know, here, now I throw this sentence at you and now it's all explained. And so again, there's like, well, why is that? Well, why is the big other there in the first place? So again, it assumes already, culture is already installed, right? Why do we have a big other? Why is it there? Why is it not there? Why is it there and not there? So there's this I think again, cultural Platonism is a very good concept, because it's these big concepts that are supposed to explain things, but they don't really explain things at all. Actually, they just basically obscure things, and that's the function of myth. The function of myth is to obscure the origins of culture, which is basically primordial murder, right? So that's why Girard calls all of these thought systems like psychoanalysis and Marxism and Freudianism and all of that, he calls that modern myths. Why? It's because they make the recognition of the scapegoating mechanism and the origin of culture in primordial murder, it obscures these insights.
But we can unveil, right? Unveil underneath these myths, like their indirect relationship with the embedded primeval murder. Right?
The Christianity is basically, I mean, the Judaism with its the Book of Job, the Christianity with its New Testament, Buddhism with its teachings about attachment and resentment and ignorance. All of these religious anthropologies, they point to the nature of desire. So they have different. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a way in this, you can even actually read the postmodern or deconstructive project as the last attempt at trying to do the Christian demythologization by taking all of these signifiers that seem to carry some kind of metaphysical weight and saying, no, there's no metaphysical weight behind it. But then they don't, you could say from a Girardian perspective, they don't quite go far enough. So Derrida just ends up with none of these signifiers actually point to anything. Meaning he's saying none of these signifiers point to what they pretend to point to. And it's funny because, I mean, Jordan Peterson, right? These postmodern neo-Marxists. If you actually take the intent of the philosophy as what it stated it wanted to do, it was supposed to create a world that is less brutal for people who are supposedly at the bottom, the proletariat. Doesn't seem to have concluded that way. We seem to be in a bit of a mess at the moment. But it's like, I come back to that thing I said at the start. It's interesting to view postmodernism and deconstruction as in this general arc of demythologizing, that now we are going back to the anthropology to actually say, no, the concept of the sacred or the transcendental does carry an ontological weight, you can say. It just has to be approached in a different direction. And this is where, for example, like my favorite enemies, the metamoderns, go completely off the track because they're just always going on about rediscovering the sacred or rediscovering the spirituality, but doing it in this kind of ironic, sincere way. Like we kind of pretend it exists, but it doesn't really. It's like, no, it fucking exists. And it's dangerous.
I agree with that. So it's the people are, you have all these neo-pagans, right, who are trying to kind of sanitizing the sacred. Like, oh, it's just like I'm hugging a tree, I'm barking at the moon, so look how much fun it is. The sacred is murder. The sacred is a mob killing murder. It's ignorance and murder because you need a story to kill the scapegoat, right? So it's both ignorance and it's cruelty and ignorance, basically. That's the sacred. There's nothing fun about the sacred, and you can't bring that back. I mean, then you're in the program of Nietzsche, right? With Nietzsche also wanted to bring back the sacred. That was basically Nietzsche's stick. Away with the concern for the victim, let's celebrate war and sacrifice. And that's Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is straight into Nazism, right? I'm not saying that Nietzsche is responsible for Nazism, but Nietzsche is the guy who kind of exposes that what happens when you bring back the sacred without knowing what it is. So, yeah. And everybody still has this really high opinion about Nietzsche, right? I mean, I have a high opinion about Nietzsche because he wrote about the disintegration of society around him and his own disintegration in a fantastic way. That's what Nietzsche is, right? And that is basically just everybody who's kind of trying to bring back the sacred or denying what the sacred is. That's basically the road of Nietzsche and the road of the road into industrial slaughter, right? The slaughter of the Nazi camps and the communist gulags. I just want to read something on page 97 about the transcendental signifier, because I think we should be a bit precise here. So Girard writes, I am not saying that we have found the true transcendental signifier. So it's not as if we suddenly have found some kind of godlike thing out there, right? So he writes, so far we have only discovered what functions in that capacity for human beings. So maybe he doesn't disagree with Derrida at all, right? Maybe they would agree on this. So, and also I would like to point out that Derrida wrote a book called Plato's Pharmacy, which was about the scapegoat mechanism, and Girard talks highly about this book. So again, we're not here, Daniel. I want to kind of really put that, make that clear. We're not here to deny the significance of thinkers like Derrida, right?
Derrida, you can bullshit on anytime you want.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, he wrote also a book about the style of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's Spores, I think it's called, and I think that's a very interesting book.
I want to ask something, Thomas. Do you think that there's anything inherently traumatic behind admitting to the truth of the primeval murder that drives these things that Girard calls religions and myths, like Marxism, Freudianism, Nietzscheism? Do you think there's anything inherently traumatic about admitting to, or even confronting this original murder that makes us want to veil it in myth time and again?
Well, I mean, it's not Trungpa, who's a Buddhist Vajrayana master. So he basically said enlightenment is the ultimate disappointment. Mm-hmm. Which I think what he refers to here is that basically all of these practices, religious practices, psychoanalysis and stuff like that, so essentially it's about understanding the nature of desire, and the nature of desire is just disappointment. That's at the heart of it all. So there's something really disappointing about understanding how humans work, the nature of desire, the fact that desire will always end up in disappointment, and also the origin of culture in mob violence and in slaughter. And then that also means that a lot of those people you hate, they probably are not as guilty as you think they are. That's not a nice thing to have to admit. And then also admitting that all these things that you desire, or that you think that other people have this and I don't have it, and that would make me happy. So understanding all of these things basically results in to a great extent a disappointment, right? So all the great books about desire, books by Proust and Cervantes and de Maupassant, they are all about disappointments. They're about the disappointing nature of Madame Bovary and stuff like that. It's about the disappointing nature of following your desires without knowing what you're doing. That's the old story, right? For us by now.
And yet it moves. And yet
desire is this machinery that moves, that keeps us moving, right? And there's no doubt that it's also functional. Capitalism to a certain extent works, technology works, science works. Science is one big game based on prestige. So there's somebody who said, like, the intense fights in academia, the fights in academia are so intense because so little is at stake. Scientific prestige. They fight over nothing. I mean, they don't. Science is basically a big fight over prestige, right? But it's functional. Nobody denies that science produces important outcomes that help us to battle disease, and that leads to technology, right? So desire can be used can be put to good effect. That's what capitalism does. That's what science does. That's what liberal democracy does. So I mean, the democracy is why does democracy work? Well, if a leader makes a mistake, right, we can get rid of that leader without killing him or her. that's the great idea about democracy. If you don't have that, you can't get rid of these people. They just keep on sitting there and making mistake after mistake. You have to, either you suffer the bad leadership, or you have to kind of make some kind of revolution and get rid of them. But that's often revolutions end up in even worse situations, right? So I think that's one of the great ideas of democracy, is basically understanding that the king is a delayed scapegoat.
And I want to make a little bit of a mess here, and expand the field.
Even more?
Oh yes, and expand the field of application of not field of application. It naturally applies. I'm just excited about it. When we see swear words like motherfucker, they are almost how to say, a symptom of this absent. It's maybe the absent original sacrifice or some sort of prohibition. Girard does speak that the original prohibitions, they come around issues like incest, sexual objects, and resources. And so this is yet another explanation for why these swear words are still the same. Or, for example, the reason why so many swear words have to do with animals. You're an asshole. You're a dog.
An asshole is an animal?
No, an ass. An ass is an animal.
Oh, yeah.
So, why? Because animals were the first sacrificial victims. Even Girard says that, in the process of hominization, you'd kill animals as a scapegoat. And I'm wondering, the cultural forms that we see today, especially and including swear words, bear the fingerprint of these prohibitions, of these original ancient prohibitions.
Yeah, they all point beyond taboos. It's like even asshole or fuck or cunt or whatever. They're all pointing to sex or nudity, which is one of the foundational prohibitions.
And though we do not have an evidence of the transcendental signifier, the one positive thing, we certainly have a lot of symptoms of its opposite, of these abject words. Again, the victim's footprints somehow, either profane or sacred, depending on whether you're Christian or not. You do find it permeating language.
Well, that's one of the interesting crossover points, say, between the Lacanian Žižekian discourse and the Girardian discourse, is that the Lacanian Žižekians are always focusing on the excess and how the excess is productive. And the Girardian point is that, the excess, the disgusting excess is ultimately the thing that we cast off. Whereas as a scapegoat, I guess, in ritual time, or as problematic desire in ordinary time. So they do actually point to the same thing.
Yes. Because the victim, insofar as it seems to emerge from the community, and the community seems to emerge from it, for the first time, there can be something like an inside and an outside, a before and an after, a community and the sacred. The victim appears to be simultaneously good and evil, peaceable and violence, a life that brings death and a death that guarantees life. There's this weird simultaneity, right?
Yeah, all the paradoxes, again, that the Hegelians are obsessed with.
Precisely. And that, once again, we see mirrored in the dichotomy between normal and ritual time somehow. Meaning two different ways to handle the same thing. Either you do a little ritual for it, or if you don't, it returns as the repressed and swear words and things like that.
It's funny, I was just thinking as well while I was out of the room for a second, going to the toilet. Again, right, Hegel is writing in the context of Protestant Germany, like, no ritual. It's all Protestantism and prohibition and keeping things very restrained, and you might say sutric. And so it's funny that these whole, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, other than that this whole massive philosophical discourse around holding paradoxes and around excess and excrement and so forth emerges in the context of a culture that's trying very hard to not do ritual and just do prohibition.
Yeah, like Thomas, what does Girard have to say about the idea of repression? Or what's the angle? Is there any?
Well, we will go to interindividual psychology in book 3, right? So where he will talk about these things as like repression, but the big difference with Freud and Girard is basically that Freud says, like, well, we learned the triangle, the model subject object, the triangle of desire. We learned that from our parents, right? So it's the the father is the model, and the mother is for the son. The father is the model, the mother is the object of desire, right? And then we basically transplant these triangles everywhere. But Girard would say it's the other way around, right? It's just the son, father, mother is one of the possible ways in which triangular desire can happen. So Freud would basically confuses the cause with the effect. So that is and in that sense, a lot of the other things like repression and stuff like that, so they don't play the same role in Girard, because Girard is like Jung, actually more concerned with the present. You're not constantly playing out what was going on with your parents. That certainly has an effect. You might have picked up some patterns there, but if you meet the wrong people or the right people, they will make you completely crazy by putting you in new triangles, right? It's not necessarily a triangle that you picked up from your parents. Not necessarily. There are many triangles. If you put yourself in other, you can pick up triangles, in amorous triangles that have nothing to do with your upbringing, and you can have triangles that have something to do with prestige, with money. You can get into triangles in science where typically people start competing over a common scientific problem, right? There it can be a very productive triangle. It can also make you crazy, right? So so I think that's kind of the difference. I think one of the things that we should definitely mention is games.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a I think is it page 97? No, it's not page. It's page 95.
95, 96.
Yeah.
Going over the page.
So who wants to do that? Owen, you wanna go through that?
Yeah, I mean, I found this bit great, right? So Girard is
go ahead.
quoting this, I guess, French sociologist called Roger Caillois. How would you pronounce that?
Caillois, I think.
Right. Caillois wrote a remarkable book entitled Les Joies and les Hommes. Again, Thomas will have to say that properly because
Les Jeux et les Hommes.
there we go. So this guy, Roger, I'm just going to stick with Roger. Roger identified 4 categories of games that seem to be specific to humans. And Girard points out that these overlap very, very nicely with the different stages that he sees as being in the sacrificial ritual. And so there's games of mimicry, of imitation, so like theater or mime. There's games of struggle or competition that he calls agon, which is the Greek word for competition, like racing or boxing, like 2 people or 2 teams facing off against each other. Then there's teams of vertigo that Caillois designates with the Greek word ilinx, which I looked up. That means whirlpool. And so Girard writes that games that consist in turning very rapidly in one place. These correspond to the hallucinatory paroxysm. A bit of reading around this on other sites suggested, obviously, this is also to do with stuff like intoxicating chemicals and anything that's going to put you into an altered state of mind. It's kind of funny that Girard doesn't want to write down drugs or alcohol. Maybe that's him being very Catholic here. Doesn't want to even suggest to anybody that you go near any of that stuff. And then finally, there's games of chance, which are the games of the sacrificial resolution. And these are the ones that, this is kind of interesting, right? So this is going back to the idea, say, of drawing straws, where the person who draws the shortest straw is the, there's that phrase, the shortest straw. If you draw the shortest straw, you typically have to do something that nobody wants to do, which ultimately resembles being the scapegoat. You are the thing that does the thing that holds the community together. Of course, there's then the inversion of the games of chance, where you win by being the one who stands out, which kind of resembles the thing we were talking in the last chapter about the king being a delayed scapegoat. The person who wins in a game of chance is actually a kind of another form of delayed or inverted scapegoat. But the point about this analysis is that if we go back, so through imitation, then competition, then through the whirlpool vertigo, and then finally the chance, this is what happens when the community gets into the state of undifferentiation or ritual, if we go with Girard's description of it. So first up, there is copying. There's desire flying around. The desire of the other, as Daniel was saying, is constantly being copied. And this leads to a point of rivalry, of serious rivalry, of potential violent rivalry. People get intoxicated, people get high, they get angry, they get rageful, they get vengeful, they get murderous. And if it's been doing, say, actually in a constructed ritual, they might very well be drunk or high. There might be shamans banging drums or crying weird things or whatever it is. And then finally someone gets murdered, and then there's a moment of silence and things calms down. And that kind of that's similar to the game of chance. It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. Let me read this thing that I just wrote down. You negate the group by picking the short straw. You are scapegoated. Then you become, which is like you go from alive to dead. Then you become less than nothing through double negation, or becoming undead by becoming the sacrifice that unites the tribe from beyond the grave. Life, death, undeadness. Negation, negation of negation. I find that this maps exactly, not just a little. It maps exactly.
Yeah, but then I mean that sounds interesting, but you wouldn't know this by just reading the original text, or like the less than nothing and this and that, and it's not so clear what all of this means, right? But now when we read Girard, now we can kind of see what all these things mean, these complicated concepts. So, but that's a bit worrying, because that means that if you only read Lacan, you will have no clue about any of this. That's I mean, and I've been there, right? I spent years reading Lacan. I thought, like, okay, this seems to be Jung, okay, interesting, Freud, okay, and then I came across Freud, Lacan. So this seems to be very interesting. But I spent years reading that, and I certainly learned something from it. But I never really had the feeling like, I don't really get this. But then when I read Girard, that's like, now I get it. This is how humans work. And then you start reading Girard, and then Girard, then you read Lacan, and Lacan makes perfect sense, right? And you can say, oh, that's what he means. But that's a bit worrying, right? I mean,
you are correct.
Because it seems that these concepts are so vague that you can kind of just throw them around, and they can basically mean anything. So what you just now say is that less than nothing means the expulsion of the scapegoat, right? So, I mean, that sounds really good. I mean, that's a good poetic description of the scapegoat, because the scapegoat becomes, in a way, not a part of the tribes, in a way, less than nothing. But now we have a nice poetic way to talk about the scapegoat. But then when you only read the poetry and you turn that into these Platonic, into these cultural concepts of cultural Platonism, right? Then you have a problem, because you use all these very expensive concepts and you throw them around, but what is behind them? That's a bit. I often have the feeling that people just say things that sound expensive, but what do these things mean, right? Is it really the same, or is it just you kind of, because they're so fluid, these concepts, that you can just pluck them out of the air and then just put them on the Girardian cathedral, right?
I said a while ago that we bear the structural sign of the scapegoating process in our unconscious psyche. So when I speak of nothing, less than nothing, alluding to Zizek and to Hegel through him, which I've never read, but I truly deeply need to. I say this because, yes, I might be alluding to an almost universal philosophical law when saying that there's there's a negation of negation, these things happen dialectically. Whereas Girard is saying something that rhymes, but with very concrete, with a very concrete, not very concrete, but rather concrete anthropological basis. I'm putting them side by side. I'm seeing that they rhyme. I truly agree with you that Girard offers us a key that without which guys like Hegel and Lacan might be obscure, but I'm still happy to stay with this rhyme, with this pattern, with this processual mimesis, almost, with this unconscious similarity between these things. And I'm not, it's still open in my head. I don't have a conclusion I'm not going to say, this or the other. but certainly staying with this feels still very feels rich.
Yeah, it can only be good to just, instead of, as maybe Jordan Peterson did with the postmodernists, just reject them without even having read them. So I think it's worthwhile to engage with thinkers and then get something out of it that might be interesting, and see things from a different light. I'm a bit careful with taking these apparently very vague concepts that can be transplanted onto all kinds of different meanings. I'm a bit careful with ending up in a word salad where you have a lot of concepts that at the end of the day don't really seem to mean a lot. Which is not the case for Girard, right? he might be wrong. Who knows? Maybe it turns out to be wrong, right? But the man is quite precise. There's not a lot of poetic freedom here, and a lot of very mysterious texts that academics write big books about. It's fairly simple. This is the way it is. This seems to be anthropology. You have mimetic desire. Desire is triangular. Conflict. You kill scapegoats. That's religion. Religion has prohibition for desire. Religion also structures ritual. So, bam.
I get where you're coming from. I get where you're coming from.
Like, okay, the negation of the negation, and the negation of the negation of the negation.
I'm uncomfortable with simply dismissing such a huge part of important philosophical, influential philosophical minds, and
I'm not dismissing them.
Salad.
I'm not dismissing them, and kind of pointing out at it, like how it's a question, like how well defined are these concepts, and because they might not be defined for a purpose, right? Philosophy if you read Hegel is to a great extent more poetry than philosophy, right? That's why everybody's discussing about what does he mean with this sentence, and then basically you have like endless discussions about this. It also means that it's not very clear what he writes about.
Depends on what you want to use it for as well, right? If it's a philosophical discussion, indeed, there's a danger of word salad, because it's the fight becomes incredibly intense when you're fighting over nothing, right? The stakes are low. It's just like who gets to have the paper on top of the other person's paper. For my personal ambition is always tied to design, is always tied to technology. To see these patterns of how desire unfolds in Girard, picking up something from Lacan, picking up something from Zizek. It's very heuristic, my approach, right? I'm not trying to figure out, okay, master system, boom, stamp of approval, a little medal on the shoulder, your peak smart guy or whatever is the title these days. But for me, it's really like, can this stuff be operative, instrumental in figuring out some new ways to deal with desire in a hyper-technological age?
Yeah.
And in that sense, Girard offers something that is deeply, deeply, deeply valuable, which is the inclusion of ideas like murder and blood, and the way that it unfolds in the human psyche, even the way that it is structural to the human psyche. You could transplant humans to Mars and give them no history, and they will repeat the same patterns. It's strange, but there are operative rules. There are operative norms. The science of power. Owen and I have been very interested in this, right? The science of the art of statecraft, of power, of leadership, how it plays out in the corporate world. That's the object of Owen's research, how it plays out through the designs of everyday life. That's what interests me. These things function according to these patterns. And the more insight you can draw from everywhere, the better, because I'll tell you something, Girard doesn't he says a lot of things, but he doesn't say everything. And I think that's what I stated in the beginning. The mission is to update for our own purposes, to appropriate, to make a mess. That's my heuristics.
To make a mess.
To make a mess of systems, and to appropriate them, and to make them make sense for your own sake and for your own purposes. And
but sometimes it works to be complicated, right? Like for Hegel, everybody's still obsessing about Hegel. It's exactly because it's so hermetic, because it's incomprehensible, and because it's so many, you can put so many meanings on it. Kojava just,
Because
basically most people, Kojava became famous that way, right? So you take Hegel, you turn it into something more comprehensible, and you put a lot of good ideas in there that don't come from Hegel, and bam, right?
Yeah.
So you have like the stamp, like, look, I engaged with something complicated that is Hegel, and you everybody comes to you to go to Hegel, right? So that's, this is very simple. That's the guru principle, right? I have something you don't have.
Exactly. This is the Girardian explanation.
Yeah,
This is the Girardian explanation of why Hegel.
That's what many people are doing right now. They're picking some really complicated thinker, Hegel or Lacan or Zizek or something like that, and then they start making that digestible. That's a super great way to get attention. Right?
You are not only correct, you are correct in ways you do not know. So Hegel in the game of philosophy, let me tell you, Hegel in the game of philosophy made himself inaccessible precisely to be, in your terms, to be the model obstacle that cannot be overcome, therefore to be and stake his position as a guru. And you so often use this trick of being the negator in the room to steer the discussion. And so in the social game of the room of whatever discussion is happening, you shake things in your own terms. You too play these games in Girardian terms in social world, and that's fine. But see how it applies. Not only there's the game of philosophy, but there's other games, and all these games are overlapping all the time. So if you're playing the game of philosophy, maybe it suits you to be obscurantist. But there's many others. If you are.
But that's why science. So these games are also going on in science. But the difference is that you have some kind of, you can play these games, but at the end of the day, if your rocket explodes in midair, or you do an experiment and it doesn't work right, then you're just simply wrong. And I kind of that's basically, I call that keeping it real, right? I try to, when I go into a discussion, I always try to think, right, what phenomenon are we talking about, and are we understanding this phenomenon better? And often philosophical discussions, I have no idea what they're about. They're basically they are about the systems themselves, and they're not referring anymore to phenomena outside of these systems. And of course, and I'm not a philosopher. I'm not trying to be a philosopher, right? I'm trying to understand how kind of humans work, and what happens when you take the archaic human and you throw that human in a world of digital networks, AI, social media, and so on. And so far, Girard has helped me a lot with that. And I like Kojava, but I like Hegel, I like all of these thinkers, but I think it's just important to kind of keep it real, unless you want a career in philosophy.
Precisely that, right? That's a deeper question, in my opinion, about the purpose of philosophy, the purpose of science. And then you made a point that could be deemed as the philosophy of science, right? You were like, what is science for? What is philosophy for? What are these games? Within these games, there's different power plays. But to say that to keep it real is to play the science.
Girard, let's not mince words here, right? For Girard and for me, most of philosophy are just myths. They're just myths. They are stories that people tell to hide the scapegoating. That's it. So want to be very clear about this.
Yeah, well, I know that.
For Girard, most of philosophy are just basically mechanisms to hide the scapegoating mechanism.
Why do people hide the scapegoating mechanism?
Why you hide that?
Why people hide the scapegoating mechanism?
Well, that is a very good question. It's because it's difficult, and because desire is very convincing. And because there is the possibility that you will be more powerful than your model, and you will get the object of desire, and you will win. And this is a very attractive prospect for people. And that's basically the Nietzschean idea. That's Nietzsche in a nutshell. You might be a powerful model that wins over all the other models, and you might get the object of desire. This is the Nietzschean way of being. And that leads to complete destruction if that spreads through a society. That's especially in a modern society, that just doesn't work. You're not going to be a powerful model that wins over all the other models. But that's a very attractive prospect. In fact, that is how you unless you are brought up in an environment that carefully teaches you this. That's your default way of behavior. You will just see the others as competitors. You will try to win over them and get the objects of desire out of them. And you also might end up in a situation where you realize you are not very powerful. The others are much more powerful models of desire. So they can hide these objects of desire from you, and then you go into depression. You basically destroy yourself, which is Freud's death drive, right? It's when you realize, like, I'm not a powerful model who will win over the others and get the object of desire. I will not have that job, that money, that wife, that husband, that attention in the community, and then if that really sinks in, right, that's when you go into depression. And first you go into mania, right, because you believe, okay, now I'm winning, oh, I'm losing, I'm winning, I'm losing. Nietzsche went into terrible cycles of mania, and his model obstacles, of course, Wagner. And he's written it down. He wrote 2 books about Wagner, right? So it's all very well documented. Nietzsche, if you want to see what desire can do, right, without any prohibition, then you read Nietzsche, and you follow what happened in Nietzsche's life, because that's what it is.
So we want to hide hide ourselves from these consequences.
But it's enjoyable to have to be part of a mob and then decide, this person is a hateful person and deserves to die, and we're going to team up and then kill that person. Super enjoyable. I mean, Facebook is
that's one way to do it, right?
Facebook, large amounts of Facebook is built on creating, finding things that people hate and then throw it at them so that they engage with it. And then you throw advertisements at them. That's it. It's enjoyable or at least in the beginning, it's enjoyable to run after objects of desire and to scapegoat people. You don't want these things to be revealed. It's unpleasant. You don't want to look at that in yourself. So you come up with all kinds of stories, from science to various interpretations of religion to hedonism and all, because you don't want to come to terms with this. Nobody really wants to hear this stuff.
I think this is where the interesting conversation and interplay for me is between religion and philosophy. And I think a lot of the grand philosophical systems of the last couple of 100 years have been trying to function in the space of religion, because society has been changing exponentially and dramatically for the last few hundred years. And I always liked actually the way that our friend Alexander Bard started his book Syntheism by just saying everything is religion. And when it's not religion, then I forget then what he says, but it's like, and if you think religion in terms of the topics we've been looking at with Girard, in terms of ritual and prohibition, okay, yes, there's rituals and there's prohibitions. Okay, that's what we seem to be structured around. And then there's lots of arguments over how society should be organized, which is really ultimately how should the rituals and the prohibitions be structured? Who gets what? How does desire get to play out, basically?
Yeah.
And it's not for me, there's also a technical question in there, because I think that's what I'm circling around. It's not a matter of saying it should be like this, but there's a big distance between saying it should be and then making it work, and making it work at scale, and making it work in a world of digital technology and algorithms.
Well, that's the thing. It's like we've been trying to find something that works. Like the communists wanted to find something that worked better than what they saw as being the brutality of century liberalism.
Yeah.
The fascists wanted to find something that worked, that they saw as working better than 19th century liberalism in the context of having lost a world war. Very similar stuff, basically. But I do think, and this is where increasingly I find myself at odds, say, with the Hegelian camp, is that Hegel, at least in the phenomenology of spirit, creates this giant pyramid with religion right at the top. You go through consciousness and self-consciousness, and then reason, and then spirituality, and then finally there's religion. But it's like, why is religion right at the top of the pyramid?
It's the other way around. It's at the bottom.
Yeah. And so people say, like, well, I haven't got to religion yet. Well, Hegel is just acting as your religion.
Isn't it cycle? But in any case, that is why, because we are looking for ways to make it work, it is useful to state the same things in different ways with different languages for different games. It's not enough to just repeat the Girardian mantra time and again. it is also useful to state it in Hegelian terms, in Žižekian terms, in Lacanian terms, in design terms, in football terms.
That's why you have religions, right? I mean, nobody's gonna. Girard will never be this universal belief this universal system. And why is that? It's because it's tied to Christianity.
Because he's not a belief system.
It will be unpalatable to a lot of people. So this is great, because it also means it will not be turned into this big system that will rule everybody, right? I mean, basically, and also so Girard wrote about this himself, and there are Girardians who wrote about it. You know, like Hinduism and Buddhism have their own way to dealing with desire and scapegoating. You find the same problematic, for the same insights, formulated in a different way, very different, but they're dealing with the same things. So you also have the moving away from scapegoating, the understanding the problematic nature of desire. There's a lot of wisdom in the anthropology of Buddhism as well. I mean, I'm at least as I've read at least as much about Buddhism than about Christianity, right? So the Christian anthropology, or the story of anthropology according to the Christians, very much focused on the scapegoating mechanism. It's extremely focused on that. While in Buddhism, it's more focused on understanding the nature of desire. So they have attachment, they have aversion, they have ignorance. What is ignorance? Ignorance is nothing else than it's the ignorance of the nature of desire. So you get overtaken by all these objects of these objects of attraction and these objects of resentment, and then it's kind of like a whirlpool. So Buddhism is very much about that. And then of course they have sutra and tantra, and so that's not really the Christian way of doing it, right? Christianity is basically, right, we have prohibitions, and then on the fringe we have art. This is not the way of Buddhism. In Buddhism you have sutra and you have tantra. And they're kind of kept in a tension within Buddhism, which is different from Christianity. So you have these different systems that are dealing with desire, and I think that's what the world is hopefully. Well, I mean that might be one of the outcomes, right? That you have all these different systems that are kind of trying to come up with a balance between the time of prohibition and the time of ritual, and they have to live next to each other, it seems, because in a hyper-connected world with nuclear weapons, I mean, you don't have that much room for error anymore, right? I mean, that would be my take on it. I mean, I'm not. That would be that's basically what I see.
This process of harmonization is not done yet. It feels to me like Girard unveiled something so profound that I think I'm personally, and I think society in general too, is coming to terms with it, coming to terms with the fact that it cannot handle or cannot even understand the truth explicitly, because we're linguistically shaped to see it implicitly in myth and to handle it indirectly, Right,
we live in this is right. We live in desire. So Girard wrote at the end of his life, he always thought the solution is Christianity, but now I am uncertain about this position outside of desire. I don't think we can be outside of desire. We have to find a solution inside desire. That's the idea of Buddhist Tantra, right? That you cannot be outside of desire. You can put prohibitions on it, but then you also have to be aware of the fact that you will never be outside of desire. So you have to have some kind of deal with that fact. And near the end of his life, Girard started playing around with these ideas, probably also because he wrote a book about Hinduism and mentioned Buddhism and stuff like that. He might have come in contact with these ideas. So it's a pity that we couldn't give Girard another 100 years, right? So we could, but now we have ChatGTP, so that's great.
But let me make a joke about this, right? You remember when there's the negation and there's the negation of negation that becomes less than nothing. The point precisely when you have three Girardians coming into a room competing to see who knows the most about Girard. Or the point where even Girard himself admits, you know what, maybe I'm just speaking, maybe we always live within desire. That's almost like a 0 point. That's yet another weird transition that I think we're not done yet, right? Girard did unveil this mechanism, but the mechanism keeps moving in ever more complex ways. We don't kill scapegoats today. We use words and games and complex things. And precisely it's way more complex than it was in the primeval tribe, I think, even though the principle is still basic and the same. So we're not done yet, and we're barely even started. That's my point.
But there's a cycle between technology and religion, right? So technology creates new human relationships, and that means it creates new types of desire, new types of rivalry, new types of scapegoating, and then religion has to update that, right? So there's this feedback loop from going from technology to religion. Also, the growth of technology requires religion, right? So because myth is nonsense. So in order to develop science, you need to get rid of myth. So so you need to dismantle or reveal the scapegoating mechanism. Otherwise, you keep on believing in this myth. So Girard says, like, we didn't stop burning witches because we developed science. It's the other way around. We developed science because we stopped burning witches. We stopped believing in myth, and that made it possible to develop science, not the other way around. It's again an example of cultural Platonism. Oh, why do we stop burning witches? Oh, well, that's because we got wiser. Why did we get wiser? Well, because science. Well, where does that science suddenly come from? That comes from the falling apart of the mythological thinking, because myth is basically just justifying murder. So we had to get rid of that in order to progress with science. This is probably one of the reasons why the Romans didn't develop certain scientific disciplines, right? So why didn't they? I mean, they knew the steam machine. Why didn't they develop an industry equivalent to 19th century England, right? With the steam machine, why not? Why didn't they use a steam? They knew the steam machine, right? They used it in toys and stuff like that. So the Romans knew the steam machine. They never used it for any big projects. Why didn't they do that? Because they had slaves. And why did they have slaves? Because they had myths, because they were pagans, they had myths, so they could kill scapegoats. So that's slavery is killing scapegoats. So there's a big link between scientific development and the revelation of the scapegoat mechanism. And we will encounter that later in the book. I think that we should wrap up. Is there anything else in this chapter that we need to talk about? So we talked about games. We talked about the emergence of religion and language and scapegoating and prohibitions at the same time. So we talked about that. So we went from the animal hierarchies to the religious system of prohibitions and scapegoating. We talked about the games. That was cool. And games, that's very cool insight, right? That games of chance, animals don't have that, and that's because they are used to pick the scapegoat in rituals, right? So even something as innocent as games of chance seems to be going back to the scapegoating mechanism. Is there anything else we need? And we talked about the transcendental signifier, which is the scapegoat, the corpse of the scapegoat, basically. Is there anything else in this chapter that we should mention? I think that's it.
I think we covered most of it. The one thing that I still feel like I still have juice to debate, like 2 minutes, not to keep you guys too long, is in the last paragraph, he says something like, it seems possible that during the ritual around the victim, that cries at first inarticulate should fall into a rhythm and become ordered like steps in a dance, particularly since ritual centered around sacrificial acts as a spirit of collaboration and agreement pervades the reenactment of all aspects of the crisis. So what comes up for me here, and what I'm interested in mapping, and this is what I'm going to try to do because I think it's very useful, is to try to look at the cultural forms today, and in their cries, in their symptoms, in the language that cultural forms today use, try to track the connection between this initial sacrificial ritual. We've just come off of the back of the World Cup, right? The worldwide ritual of teams going against each other, scapegoats. My God, Messi is the GOAT.
Well, of course, everyone wanted to shout shit at him for wearing that Arab cloak. Perfect example. Everyone was like, oh my God, Messi wore an Arab cloak.
And he's the GOAT, greatest of all time. He's the GOAT. Like, he's the king in waiting to fail. Like, Maradona was perfect because he also died from drugs. He was the perfect rock star. So this is what's
the king is the delayed scapegoat. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I feel like it would be very fruitful, especially for people like us who are trying to like investigate future cultural forms and the design of the future rituals. I think a great step is to try to track the faint outlines of the original sacrificial primeval murder in contemporary cultural forms. Messi is the goat. You know, things like that, the underdog. And I'm just speaking specifically about the World Cup. There's many others. Ben Shapiro destroys liberal arts student with facts and logic. This is not only like repressed sexual, or is like a porn title, but there's also implicit violence. Is my guy beats your guy? This is the discourse of the other that I find so interesting. And in it, yes, we still see the blood of the murder. I don't know. That's my homework for the next.
Yeah, that is of course true, right? So these archaic patterns are everywhere, and people indulge in them. We're actually pretty good at avoiding escalation, I would say. People seem to have forgotten that. I mean, we have, even in the States, right? People say, oh, the States are in chaos and there's so much conflict. But I mean, look at the States in the 20s. I mean, there was huge violence there, you know, sectarian violence between groups in the society and stuff like that. You know, I think under President Woodrow Wilson, that was like one big chaos, right? So these are fairly benevolent times with some exceptions, right? Okay, we have the conflict in Ukraine, we have the tension around Taiwan, but it seems that there's a lot of checks and balances that keep the archaic human in its place. I think that capitalism, democracy, the tolerance, so basically the fact that people can have different religions without killing each other, these things keep us from destroying ourselves, right? It also means that it comes at a price, right? There's a certain indifference. We don't know our neighbors anymore, but everybody's very individualized. But that also means that you don't get easily outraged and adopt a group mentality, right? So that's what capitalism basically does, right? So we become individual consumers, which everybody thinks is really bad. But what people don't seem to realize is that the more you link people together and the more they adopt group mentalities, the more problematic things become, right? He killed somebody in my tribe was killed. We need to kill somebody from the tribe who is responsible for that, right? So that's the problem with creating tight-knit groups of people. The problem is, I think, that we need a lot of energy to do all of this. I mean, literally, right? I mean, literal energy. I mean, like nuclear energy, gas, coal, oil, solar, wind, whatever. But we need an enormous amount of energy to kind of keep all these mechanisms in place.
Yeah.
And I think the link between the archaic human and the energy that is used to keep the archaic human in systems that prevent escalation, I think that is a very interesting topic of discussion.
We need excess energy, excess consumption of endless objects that are reproduced ad infinitum to actually compensate for the murders that do not happen, and also a proliferation of interests and niche interests in communication through the internet. Ever more refined, like social and cultural forms emerge to keep that steam going somewhere. That doesn't mean excessive conflict. I think that's why today we see such a wide and weird proliferation of cultural forms, to paraphrase I think it's Giorgio Agamben, like a proliferation of apparatuses. That's the technical term that would describe, in my view, like how do you plug the instinctive technically need for sacrifice. How do you plug that? How do you make that work for 7 billion people?
Yeah, now we have AI coming up, which starts to understand us better than we understand ourselves. So soon we will have, what Alexander Barth calls it digital anthropology, right? Just harvesting data from soon we will have, and we will already have that, right? So we have these systems that look at large amounts of data and then start simulating human behavior, analyzing human behavior. So that will be, and how will we structure our world with these algorithms? That is going to be very, very interesting, right? But it seems that there are different models now. So central state that uses algorithms to keep the population in check. Or you also have like these more chaotic systems, like the American system, which is very much checks and balances. conflict between different blocks of power, and then making sure that none of these blocks win. So these seems to be the different models.
Fantastic. A lot of questions at the end rather than answers, which is probably a good
Yes,
place.
and we are totally unqualified to answer them, but that doesn't stop us from making some kick-ass podcasts, and at least keeps us reading this book. Yeah, I think it was a great session. That's only chapter 3, right? So we are at page
99. We're on page 99.
Page 99. So next chapter will be chapter 4. And that is about something we already talked about. That is about myth. So the invisibility of the founding murder. So for Girard, myth is not a beautiful story that tells us about human psychology, like the Jungians would claim, right? Or maybe even Jordan Peterson, and the C is the unconscious and blah, blah, blah. But for Girard, myth is just the justification. It's simply the justification of the mob to kill a scapegoat. We're gonna kill the scapegoats, and we're gonna use this story. So the Nazi story about the Jews, that is the prime example of a modern myth, and that's basically how Girard thinks about myth, and that will be the topic of the next chapter. Are we up for that, gentlemen?
Yes,
sounds great.
Very interested to think about that one in the context of art as well, actually. So myth and art and Girard.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting topic. That's also related to the topic of does Girard just simply reject ritual and equate it with scapegoating, or can it be warped, modified, brought up to date in a different form? I think that is a question that I think that is something that where Girard should give us a bit more answers, and I think we will get them in the course of this book, one way or another. All right, shall we call it?
Guys. Let's wrap up.
All right. Bye.
Good stuff. Thank you very much.